Hey guys, welcome back to Mystic Historia, where we uncover the hidden stories of money, power, and empires. If you're fascinated by how finance built and destroyed the world's greatest powers, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear might completely change how you see global history. This is the story of the Sterling Crisis, the moment when the mighty British Empire, ruler of 1/4 of the earth, quietly sold its empire piece by piece, just to keep its currency alive. It's a story of gold, greed, an illusion how a nation that once printed the money the whole world used ended up begging for loans from its former colony. And maybe, just maybe, it's a warning about what happens when any empire believes its currency is invincible. Imagine the world in the late 1800s. Everywhere you looked, from Bombay to Cairo, from Cape Town to Hong Kong, fluttered the Union Jack. British merchants controlled the seas, British soldiers guarded trade routes, and British banks decided the value of money itself. At the center of it all stood the pound sterling, a coin so trusted that its very name meant purity. If you had a pound, you had gold. And if you had gold, you had power. For over a century, that simple faith built the largest empire in human history. London wasn't just a city. It was the world's cash register. Ships from every continent carried tea, cotton, and spices to British ports, and in return, London financed railways, mines, and governments across the globe. It was the first true age of globalization, and the pound was its bloodstream. But the empire's wealth wasn't made of endless gold. It was made of credit, of promises that the Bank of England could convert paper into metal. The empire worked like a delicate illusion. As long as everyone believed the pound was as good as gold, it was. But beneath the grandeur, cracks were forming, and those cracks would grow into earthquakes. Then came 1914, the year everything changed. When Britain declared war on Germany, it entered the most expensive conflict in human history. Within weeks, gold began fleeing the country. Citizens lined up outside banks, demanding to exchange their notes for metal. The government panicked, and for the first time in 2 centuries, Britain suspended the gold standard. The pound was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by faith and gunpowder. The war devoured money faster than ammunition. Britain printed billions in new pounds, borrowed from the United States, and sold off chunks of its overseas investments. By 1918, it had won the war but lost its financial independence. London was still the world's financial heart, but now it owed that heart to New York. When peace returned, British leaders wanted to restore the old glory. They believed if they could make the pound equal to gold again, the empire's strength would return. So in 1925, under Chancellor Winston Churchill, Britain repegged the pound to its pre-war value. It was a bold, patriotic move and a catastrophic mistake. The pound was now overvalued. British exports became expensive, and unemployment soared. Factories shut down, and in 1931, after a desperate attempt to defend the currency, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard again. The illusion was over. Fast forward to 1939. Another world war ignites, but this time Britain is already broke. To keep fighting Hitler, London mortgages the last of its foreign assets, empties its gold vaults, and turns again to America for help. The U.S. agrees, but at a price. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 supplies Britain with food and weapons, yet behind the generosity lies a quiet condition. Britain must dismantle the imperial trade barriers that protected its colonies. To survive the war, Britain began surrendering the very economic system that made it an empire. By the time victory came in 1945, the country that had once financed the world was drowning in debt. Its cities were bombed, its industries exhausted, and its foreign reserves were almost gone. Then came Bretton Woods in 1944, the meeting that decided the future of global money. Representatives from 44 nations gathered to design a new financial order. The British delegation, led by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes, proposed a neutral global currency so no single nation would dominate the system. But the Americans, holding 3/4 of the world's gold, refused. They insisted that the US dollar, backed by gold at $35 per ounce, become the world's reserve currency, and so it At that moment, the torch of financial empire quietly passed from London to Washington. Britain might have won the war on the battlefield, but it lost the peace at the conference table. Post-war Britain tried to act like the same old empire, but by 1947, the mask was slipping. Food was rationed, factories struggled, and the nation owed more than it could ever repay. The United States now demanded that the pound become fully convertible into dollars. It sounded like a vote of confidence, but it was a trap. The moment convertibility began, foreign holders of pounds rushed to swap them for dollars. Within weeks, billions flowed out of Britain's reserves. The government had no choice but to suspend convertibility. It was the infamous sterling crisis of 1947, the day Britain finally realized it could not defend both its empire and its currency. The country faced a brutal decision. Either sacrifice the colonies to save the pound, or let the pound collapse to keep the empire. They chose the first. Britain began the slow process of decolonization. India had already gained independence that very year. Other colonies would follow. One by one, Britain's global possessions slipped away, not because of revolutions, but because the empire could no longer afford them. The world had witnessed something extraordinary. A global superpower selling its empire to save its money. Yet saving the pound didn't restore greatness. It only prolonged decline. In 1949, Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 30%. For the rest of the world, it confirmed what everyone already suspected, that the British Empire was finished. London's bankers, once masters of global credit, now had to beg the IMF for emergency loans. It was humiliation on a grand scale, but this humiliation teaches the central truth of our story. Currency is empire. When you lose control of your money, you lose control of your destiny. Britain would limp through the 1950s and 60s, trying to pretend the pound still mattered. Each crisis was soothed with American dollars. Each loan came with new strings attached. By the 1970s, the pound had fallen from a global reserve to a regional currency. The world had a new monetary monarch, the US dollar. And the irony is breathtaking, because the same financial disease that destroyed the British Empire, overborrowing, overprinting, and defending an illusion of strength, would, decades later, infect the American system too. So when we look back at the sterling crisis, it isn't just a story about one country's collapse. It's a mirror showing us how every empire dies the same way. Slowly, then all at once. Not with gunfire, but with a silent run on its money. So what happened next? The world had changed. London's banks still looked grand, but behind the illusion, power had shifted west. Across the Atlantic, a new financial empire was awakening. The United States of America, armed not just with armies, but with the printing press of the new world currency. After 1945, the U.S. produced half the world's goods and held 3/4 of its gold. Every nation that needed to rebuild, France, Germany, Japan, borrowed American dollars, and every one of those dollars was, by law, convertible into gold. It sounded stable. It sounded permanent. But as Britain already knew, nothing in finance is permanent. In the 1950s, Washington began running the same playbook London once did, financing global influence with promises, not metal. The Cold War, new military bases, all paid in dollars that flowed overseas faster than the gold that backed them. By the 1960s, foreign central banks were drowning in green paper and quietly wondering, what happens if we all ask for our gold back? One man decided to find out. President Charles de Gaulle of France. In 1965, he sent the French Navy across the Atlantic. Ships loaded with dollars, demanding repayment in gold. Other nations followed. America's gold pile began to shrink. It was the start of the same run that once gutted the Bank of England. Sound familiar? Then came August 5th, 10th, 1971. President Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced he would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. In reality, temporary meant forever. Who's like that? The gold standard was gone. The world entered the age of fiat currency paper, backed only by political will. America was doing what Britain did half a century earlier to maintain its global dominance. But America had one advantage. Britain never did. In 1973, as the Arab oil embargo struck. American officials negotiated a secret pact with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would sell oil only in US dollars, and in return America would protect the kingdom. Soon every OPEC nation followed. If you wanted oil, you needed dollars, and thus was born the petrodollar systema. New empire, where energy replaced bullion. While Washington celebrated, London watched with a mix of envy and relief. The pound had fallen, but Britain had found a new role as the world's financial broker. Still, the cost at home was visible everywhere. By the mid-1970s, Britain faced stagflation. People called it the winter of discontent. Once again, the pound came under attack. In 1976, Britain sought an IMF bailout, the largest loan ever requested at that time. It was a moment of national shame. The empire that had once lent money to half the world was now borrowing to pay its own bills. But this humiliation produced one of history's greatest economic turnarounds. Under Margaret Thatcher, Britain reinvented itself as a financial hub. The pound survived, but as a servant of markets, not their master. So let's zoom out. Look at the pattern across centuries. Rome debased its silver to pay soldiers. Spain flooded Europe with New World gold and triggered inflation. Britain printed pounds to finance its empire, and the United States replaced gold with promises and oil. Every empire, in its final stage, tries to defend the illusion of value long after real wealth is gone. The sterling crisis is a blueprint. Every empire eventually follows when money stops reflecting production and starts reflecting power. Minutes from a 1947 British meeting reveal the fear. One official said, "To lower the pound is to confess the empire is over." Another replied, "Then perhaps it's time we faced it." In that quiet exchange, you can hear an empire ending. When the British Empire fell, it left behind a financial philosophy that debt could substitute for dominance and confidence could substitute for reality. America inherited that philosophy. And as long as the world keeps believing in the dollar, the illusion continues. But if belief fades, history will repeat. Because here's the truth. Money is faith. The sterling crisis was the moment that faith cracked. And cracks, once opened, never truly close. Today, as nations accumulate gold again and trade in new currencies, the echoes of the sterling crisis grow louder. It reminds us that even the mightiest empire can't print trust. So when you hold a pound, a dollar, or a euro, remember the story behind it. It isn't just currency, it's history compressed into ink and numbers. As Britain's sun finally set over its empire, a new light rose across the Atlantic. The United States, untouched by war on its soil, its factories roaring, its gold reserves overflowing, was ready to inherit the financial throne. But here's the paradox that history loves to repeat. Every new empire thinks it's different, that its currency is immortal. The British pound, after all, had once seemed just as unshakable. In 1944, inside a quiet New Hampshire hotel called Bretton Woods, world leaders gathered to rebuild the shattered post-war economy. What emerged wasn't just a treaty, it was the architecture of modern global money. The British fought to preserve sterling's prestige, but the truth was brutal. London was bankrupt. Power had shifted to Washington. The agreement made the US dollar the anchor of the world. Every other currency would tie itself to it, and the dollar itself would be backed by solid gold at $35 an ounce. Gold was the world's trust, and America owned nearly all of it. For a moment, it seemed perfect. The pound had ruled the 19th century. The dollar would rule the 20th. But beneath this new empire of money, the same fatal flaw was already growing. The illusion that you can print wealth forever. In the 1950s and 60s, the US played the exact same role Britain once had. Global policeman, financier, and consumer of the world's goods. It was glorious. Factories thrived, families prospered, and the dollar symbol became as powerful as the Union Jack ever was. But behind the boom, debts were piling up. America's gold stock was shrinking, while dollars flooded the globe to fund military bases, reconstruction plans, and Cold War projects. By the 1960s, foreign nations held more dollars than the US had gold to redeem. Sound familiar? That was precisely how the sterling crisis began decades earlier. Empire printing claims it couldn't honor. The French economist Jacques Rueff, who had watched sterling collapse, warned Washington bluntly, "You are repeating the exact mistake of the British." But like all empires, drunk on success, America wasn't listening. By 1971, the illusion broke. France demanded gold for its dollars. Other countries followed. The vaults at Fort Knox were bleeding yellow metal. So, President Richard Nixon made a fateful decision. On August 15, 1971, he went on live television and declared, "I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold." Temporarily became forever. Gold was dead. Money had become pure faith. And with that one move, the last link between wealth and real value was severed. The world entered a new age of fiat empires. When sterling fell, Britain lost control of global trade. America learned from this. It found a new anchor, not in gold, but in something far more essential to the modern world: oil. In the mid-1970s, Washington made a secret deal with Saudi Arabia. The arrangement was simple. Saudi oil would only be sold in US dollars, and in return America would guarantee military protection. The result was genius, and a little sinister. Every country now needed dollars to buy oil, and to get dollars, they had to trade, borrow, or invest through the American financial system. This was the petrodollar system, the invisible empire that replaced the British one, enforced not by ships, but by spreadsheets. But there was a catch, the same one that destroyed sterling. The system depended on trust, on the belief that the dollar would always be stable and backed by a powerful nation. Yet, as America's debt ballooned, wars dragged on, and industries moved overseas, cracks began to show. The U.S. could now print money with no gold limit, but every note printed was another quiet confession: we are living on borrowed time. The empire of credit had replaced the empire of colonies. Look closely, and the parallels are chilling. Britain financed global wars with borrowed money. America did the same in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Britain relied on its colonies for cheap goods. America relies on Asia for manufacturing and to buy its debt. Britain's middle class was crushed by inflation. America's middle class now faces the same hollowing out, with stagnant wages and rising costs. And as new powers risk China, India, the Gulf states, they are doing exactly what America once did to Britain: questioning the old reserve currency, building alternatives, and quietly accumulating gold. The stage is set for the next act. Every empire believes its money is different. The British said it in 1913. The Americans say it today. But trust, once lost, is gone forever. When the pound cracked, the world moved to the dollar. When the dollar cracks, there will be no single replacement, only fragmentation, chaos, and a struggle for a new order. History doesn't repeat word for word, it rhymes. And the next verse is already being written. The dollar became more than a currency. It became a weapon, a tool for influence, sanctions, and control. But power always creates imbalance. The more the world used dollars, the more America could print them. And the more it printed, the more the world depended on them. It was a perfect loop, until it was empty. By the 1980s, the cracks began to show. Manufacturing declined, and finance became the new factory. America wasn't producing wealth anymore. It was borrowing it. The middle class began to vanish, just as it did in Britain a century earlier. People still felt rich, but it was a mirage built on borrowed time. Then came the 21st century, terror wars, bailouts, zero interest rates, and finally, the pandemic, the ultimate stress test. Trillions created in months, checks mailed to every home. Markets soaring while supply chains crumbled. Inflation returned like a ghost from the past, the same ghosts that once haunted the streets of London. And as inflation spread, the whispers began again. Is the dollar next? Across the world, nations started preparing. Russia began selling oil in rubles, China in yuan. The BRICS nations discussed a new currency backed by commodities. The shift is subtle, but it's happening. A slow retreat from dollar hegemony, just like the retreat that once stripped the pound of its crown. The pattern is too precise to ignore. An empire builds global systems. Its money becomes the lifeblood of trade. It overextends with wars and debts. Inflation weakens its foundation. Foreign nations lose faith. A crisis hits. And suddenly, the world looks elsewhere. Rome lost to debasement. Spain lost to silver. Britain lost to sterling. Will America lose to the dollar? The signs are eerily familiar. Mountains of debt, a shrinking industrial base, and a government that spends what it doesn't have. But perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't the fall itself, it's the denial before it. Every empire believes it's different. The real question isn't asterisk when asterisk the dollar falls. It's what comes after. Because when the money that runs the world loses its meaning, everything tied to it must be revalued. Empires don't end with explosions. They end with silence de silence, when the world realizes the paper it trusted no longer holds value. And maybe, just maybe, we're already hearing that silence grow louder. If you found this story powerful, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for the next deep dive into the hidden patterns that shape our world. Because the past isn't dead. It's just quietly repeating itself, and you're living inside its echo.